Welcome to episode 16 of Project Traction, my project to convert a 2017 Mustang to all-wheel drive. This video is going to be a little different, and I'm going to cover a bunch of things that I did basically almost 2 years ago, or before I made the first video, right? Where I did a lot of mock-up and trying to prove everything was even going to fit in the car before I got too serious getting the transmission in. And so I have a lot to cover, so let's get right into it. So one of the first things I had to do before I could work on the front suspension and diff and oil pan and everything was figure out a way to be able to support the engine with the front cross member completely out of the car and have the engine float. And so I basically went to Harbor Freight and got one of their, readily available little engine bay crossbar strut contraptions to hold engines up. But of course a Coyote doesn't have any provisions in the center of the car, or center of the engine to hold it up like say an old carbureted car would have. And so what they do have though, which maybe people don't realize, is that on the side of the left-hand head, or in the US the driver's side head, there are two 14mm bolts that are designed for this very purpose. And then likewise on the back of the right head, or the passenger side head in the US, there's also two 14mm bolts that are meant for this very purpose. Ford actually sells, I'm not sure they sell, but they do exist, some brackets that Ford produces. They come on the crate motors that bolts onto these things here. But they're, at least even on eBay, they're quite expensive. So I just got some scrap steel here and kind of kludged up and bent it around to make it clear the valve cover. Let me zoom back here. And basically made a bracket for the right and left sides of the engine here. Let me shoot to the other side and show you the one on the back of the head. This one's a little harder to see, but once again there's actually two 14mm bolts on the back of the passenger side head for this very purpose. And once again I just took some scrap steel and made a part that cleared everything. It has to clear the AC. So once I had those two brackets, I simply made a crossbar that hooks them together. I think you can see it here, to get the load in the middle, right? So I could support with the Harbor Freight little wing nuts here, if you want to call them that. And I made these two crossbars that basically interface with the hooks. And these little stops at the end prevent the danger of the hooks ever falling out. Obviously, when this thing's holding up the engine, and you're underneath it, this is quite important. This is just a fixture, so nobody mocked my welds. This is all just thrown together. But it is pretty overkill. As you can see, there's 4 3/8 bolts on both sides, and of course the 14mm bolts going into the head. Anyways, this has served me well. I built this almost 3 years ago now, and it's been invaluable for the project to be able to support the engine. So that was the first step in being able to start fabricating the front of the car. So once I could, basically support the engine, and I could take the front cross member in and out, it became quite obvious that I needed to have a kind of a radical or a big solution for the motor mount. So this is a stock S550 front cross member, and you can see here it uses these really huge, large hydraulic motor mounts, and this goes to an aluminum arm on the engine. And if you can imagine, if we go here, this is where one of the front control arms comes out, so the wheel is basically right here, and this is exactly where the axle has to go, right? And so there's no possible way we can utilize this really tall hydraulic motor mount. And so luckily I could have made something from scratch, but luckily the aftermarket motor mounts, which are, you know, meant to bolt into the stock crossmember from BMR and Steeda and a few other companies, I think. They're all similar. They're basically just a simple polyurethane puck with a sheet metal piece and then a stud going through, and they're dramatically shorter. And then they give you spacers to adjust your engine height. So I decided to basically throw all this away, start with one of those motor mounts and see how high I could basically get it to see if I could get the axle to go underneath it. So to compare, here's the factory hydraulic motor mount. This is just some kind of little guard. We'll get rid of that. And you can see the height of it. And here is a BMR motor mount with one of basically the main spacer plus one of the extra spacers on top. And it basically is supposed to mimic the stock height, but if you simply just throw out this spacer, this is the equivalent part here, you end up with this, right, which is now much shorter on top and bottom. And so by utilizing this and then moving it up so I can get the space, if that, let me put that right there. You can see now how it dramatically increases the space because the CV joint is going to be right here and basically solves that problem. And so then I just needed something to obviously bolt this to. Jumping back here to the stock cross member, it quickly becomes apparent that all of this has to go away, right? Because once again, this is exactly where the CV joint wants to be, is where all of this structure is. And so I could just try to put a hole in here, but since I'm basically taking this cross member out just shy of like 1 billion times, I thought I would basically take an idea that I saw on the internet. I got the idea from these Maximum Motorsports S197 crossmember, where you basically have two pieces that bolt to the chassis that incorporate the motor mount provisions, and then the crossmember itself bolts to that. That way you can remove the crossmember while leaving the engine and the motor mounts in place for things like oil pan access. And since I would be taking my crossmember off many times, as I've mentioned, and or need access to the oil pan for final tweaks, I thought this would be very advantageous. So I took this idea and ran with it. So once I decided to kind of take Maximum Motorsports lead and make a part that bolted to the chassis that incorporates the motor mount that's separate from the crossmember, I basically, as you can see, I kind of hacked up the original crossmember just to make a piece and put that on both sides here to hold the engine in the stock location. I then decided I wanted to raise the engine a little bit, so I actually put some washers between the motor mounts and the engine to raise it 3/8 of an inch. It actually helps with the angles when it comes to the rear drive shaft too, but more importantly it increases the axle centerline of the differential. But anyways, and so now I had the engine floating in space supported by the original motor mounts, and so then with that cross member on top, you know, the Harbor Freight strut brace, whatever you want to call it, I could keep one side always bolted to the stock motor mount to keep it in the correct position, and then make the pieces for the opposite side, being careful to measure to make sure the height was right, you know, so the motor is still level. And that worked out pretty well, doing one side at a time. The result of all that were these pieces here. This is the driver's side, or the left side, driver's side in the US, and this is the passenger side. You notice how the motor mount is offset to the rear in this case to clear the differential. That was one of those whoopsies here. Basically the stock aluminum mount on the motor side or the engine side followed the differential. Little jump ahead here, but here's the differential I used for mock-up. But anyway, so I actually had to move the motor mount back and then make a new engine side bracket, which I'll show you here in a little bit. So basically this is steel. I seriously pondered after the test drive or the last video making these all over again from scratch out of aluminum. But after bolting everything back in, I made these 2 years ago now, before my first video. It all just works and goes in and it puts the engine in the right spot. And my friend talked me out of, shout out to Harold once again, who's been helping me on this project all along, to convince me just to use these. They are geometrically correct. Yeah, they are a little heavy, and could I make them better now? Well, absolutely. But I kind of considered these just mock-up pieces, but they fit perfectly. And if I'm going to get this thing on the wheels here this year, I got to, pick my battles. And one of my battles is not to remake these. So, might be a future project once I realize how heavy this beast is going to be. Anyways, you can see how the motor mounts bolt into this, and I'll show them in the chassis next. So looking underneath the car here, you can see this is the left side or driver's side mount, and you can see how it bolts to the chassis and independent of the cross member. And there's the much shorter BMR motor mount. Of course, this isn't actually tight, and this is the stock aluminum engine side motor mount here. Let me get a better angle if you can see all that. And once again, I did raise the engine 3/8 of an inch with the option of maybe spacing another 1/8 to 1/4, depending what I can get by with here. The opposite of what most people do, which is lower the engine, but they don't have a front differential. Anyways, you can see here how it provides, if you can see the angle here, provides clearance for a future CV joint that's going to be coming out of that tube, and makes everything work out. The right side, the passenger side, was not quite as simple. You can see here's the future provisions for mounting the front diff, and basically the diff is right here. I can't put it in with this motor mount in there because it inherently follows it, right? So that's where I had to be a little bit more creative, and I had to replace this with a new steel piece I made, and I'll show that next. So here's the steel motor mount that I made. I'll show it bolted to the actual frame side here in a second. Kind of like the frame side brackets, where this was originally going to be just a first iteration version, and I was going to redo it, make it lighter somehow, and just make it look better, to be honest. But once again, it works. The engine's in the right place. It's more than strong enough. If I would have thought it was going to be the final piece, I would have made it look better and probably made the welds a little cleaner. But I got to pick my battles, and I'm going to send it basically, and just use it the way it is. I probably will cut these brackets off and make better brackets for. These are provisions to make a bracket that goes down to hold the front diff. So is this, and I need to make a few tweaks to it yet, and I'll flapper wheel it and obviously get a better paint job on it. But it works, and like I said, I'm going to send it. So here's the passenger side motor mount with the new bracket on the engine, the frame side, the BMR mount in between, and as you can see, it provides a lot more clearance for the differential to live right there, and which was kind of the point here. Now you're probably asking, then what does the future modified crossmember actually bolt to? And that's these parts right here. But basically these bolt to the chassis side brackets that I have just shown in the car. Here you can probably now get the idea where this bracket here, which bolts to the part that gets left behind with the chassis, incorporates the motor mount. This will be welded with some uprights to the cross member and will come off with the cross member. So all that effort and work is for one purpose, to get this to fit in the front. And I covered this a little bit in episodes 1 and 2. But this is at least the type of differential I'm going to use in the front, which is a Toyota 7.5 inch from like an 86 through 95 or so Toyota pickup. And this one is this is the mock-up one. I will be going to a different one and not just sending this one, as I've been saying. That's actually the one I'm going to use. It is white, and not because it's been painted. This is all just chalk. Is because I had it 3D scanned, and the scanner we used didn't want to pick it up, so we sprayed some chalk on it, and allows me to get a 3D model so I can do the version 2 of the oil pan. Anyways, I'll put this back in the car to get one last shot showing the motor mounts clearing this. But basically, like I said, this is pretty hack and slash, but the idea here is, here's the stock side of the diff. I'm going to machine this back to get more clearance, to get it closer to the oil pan, and then machine like a spud to press in here, which you can see on this side here. This aluminum spud was pressed in, and that spud then gets piloted here on the side of the oil pan. And the two studs that are the factory studs that stick out of the side of the differential go into these two holes here. And then this allows the shaft to go through the oil pan. I'm going to for sure redo this. This tube in the middle isn't big enough. I want this to be beefier, and I'm pretty convinced now if I make my own CNC diff cover, which I'm going to do, I can move it forward another 1/4 inch or 3/8 of an inch, which is really quite critical. But and then make some better bracketry to hold everything. But let me get the diff in the car, and you can see that. Well, there's the differential in the car. Now it becomes really obvious why I wanted a low pinion diff, right, versus a high pinion diff. Because, you know, obviously here's the starter and the bell housing, and you can imagine trying to fit a high pinion diff, this flange would be right where the starter is. But otherwise it fits pretty good. It is kind of a heavy beast, weighs about 50 some pounds. I'm going to try to grind away as much as possible here, get some weight out of it. But you can see here, with the factory diff cover removed, the limiting factor about how far forward I can move it is the AC compressor, and I'm going to make my own CNC cover and try to sneak it forward another 1/4 of an inch. Basically, it already, the center line of the differential is not, this is the center line. Let me get a better angle here. Let's see if I can see it. The center line of the wheel is right here, and it's about an inch and a 1/4 back, 1.5 inches from the center line of the differential right now. And that actually is more important than the vertical when it comes to CV axle angles. So I'm going to try to get it as far forward as I can and get it a little bit more square too. Like I said, that oil pan was a proof of concept, and unlike the motor mounts, I am going to redo that from scratch. Well, that's a wrap on episode 16 of the all-wheel drive Mustang project, Project Traction. I covered a lot of information in this one, so if you have any questions, please leave some comments below and I'll do my best to answer them. Otherwise, please like and subscribe, and thanks for watching.